And my name is Bui Thu, and I'm the coordinator for the third Mekong Chison Conference. Our conference is a biennial event co-organized by Zavik English Center and the University of Wollongong. We hope to establish a professional community for Vietnamese local teachers and international colleagues to exchange ideas for effective teachings. And before our meeting our presenter, let's go through a few housekeeping rules. First, to guarantee the sound quality, participant audio is automatically disabled. And if you have any technical problems and you need support, please use the raise hand button. To comment or to interact with the presenter and other participants, please write your ideas in the chat box. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in a Q&A box. You can expect our speaker to have about 10 minutes for a short Q&A at the end of her presentation. And we are recording this webinar, so you can watch it again on our YouTube channel 3 days after the webinar. And also, there's a link to the feedback form we'll send to you to your email. And by committing the form, your feedback and attendance would be recorded. And we are delighted to send the webinar handouts and other related links to you as a thank you gift. Okay, now we can begin. The topic today is Teachers' Language Assessment Literacy, a case study at a high school in Halong. And our today's speaker is Miss Bui Thu Ha. So she's a graduate in English language teacher education from the Universities of Languages and International Study, with several awards for the excellent student achievement and also the consolation prize in teacher research competitions at the faculty level. And now Ha is currently pursuing the master program at the University of Western Australia with various scholarships. Now, please welcome Ms. Ha.
Okay, thank you for that lovely introduction. So hello everyone. So how are you doing today? Okay. Right. So okay. So let me begin my presentation. Okay. Okay, so today I'm going to deliver a presentation called Teachers' Language Assessment Literacy, a case study at a high school in Halong. Right. So my presentation will include 5 main parts. The first one is introduction, then literature review, methodology, findings and discussion, and last but not least, conclusion. Right, so we will come to the first part, which is introduction. So in this session, I'm going to cover the problem statement and rationale for the study, the aims and objectives of this study, and the significance of it. Right. Okay, so we come to the first one, which is the problems in English teachers' assessment practices in Vietnam. Right, so despite increased attention given to language assessment, so there is a strong live evidence that demonstrate this mismatch between expected assessment practices and teachers' actual conducts. So an overwhelming majority of Vietnamese public high school teachers, they are heavily reliant on paper-based testing with undue attention given to lexical and grammatical aspects, because these would often show up in the actual test, according to Huang 2010. And in addition, grades are often administered to students without any sort of feedback. And a number of teachers actually made the attempt to do so, but due to its insufficient and unconstructive nature of the feedback, then it could not add up to facilitate the student progress. And after each test, so most teachers, they pay optimal focus attention to students' grades in conformity with their administrative responsibility. That is that they have to record the grades for their schools, and they do not engage in evaluating the test or diagnosing the students' gaps in knowledge. All right, so with that being said, so these considerations, they lay the foundation for future study into language assessment. And after having read a lot of relevant materials, I have detected the following gaps. So the first one is that Vietnamese teachers' perceptions of their language assessment have not been discussed at length. And the second one is that their training needs for language assessment have been absent from a larger part of existing research. This research was designed to, first of all, to investigate how English teachers perceive their language assessment literacy in their teaching practices. And the second one is to find out their perceived training needs in terms of language assessment. Right. So in response to those two mentioned objectives, so I have proposed these two research questions. The first one, what are the perceptions of English teachers at a high school in Halong of their language assessment literacy? And the second one, what are language assessment training needs as identified by English teachers at a high school in Halong? Right. And this study, the work reported here is expected to be of value in enriching the literature review with regard to language assessment literacy in the context of Vietnam. And it is also hoped to deliver an overall picture of teachers' assessment training needs and offer a baseline for teacher education training programs to identify and cater for teachers' training needs on language assessment. So we come to the second part, which is the literature review. So in this session, I'm going to deliver the definition of language assessment literacy that was used throughout my whole research. And the second one is the framework of language assessment literacy, which was also used in this research. So there have been a number of definitions of language assessment literacy proposed in the past, but so here I'm just going straight to the point with the definition that I chose for my research, which is the one by Davies, 2008. So according to Davies, language assessment literacy was defined as a combination of knowledge, skills, and principles. So knowledge here refers to awareness of relevant background in measurement and language description, as well as in context setting. Skills refer to those necessary for test design, use, and interpretation of assessment data and test evaluation. And principles relate to appropriate and legal conducts of including fairness, transparency, and ethics. Okay, so in this definition, equal attention was given to knowledge, which is the descriptive, skills, the practical, and principles, the theoretical. Considering that all are necessary, but one without the other is likely to be misunderstood and or trivialized, according to Davies, 2008, page 335. And considering its comprehensiveness in covering all the relevant factors and its high credibility and its suitability for being a basis for thorough investigation into language assessment literacy. So this definition was used throughout the whole research. Right. So building on that definition, Giardo's 2018 proposed a list of 8 dimensions of language assessment literacy. So, and they were classified under the 3 main central components, which are knowledge, skills, and principles. So here is a brief summary of the 8 dimensions. So in knowledge, we have awareness of applied linguistics, awareness of theory and concepts, and awareness of language assessment context. Skills include instructional skills, design skills for language assessment, skills in educational measurement, and technological skills. And principles refer to the awareness of and action towards critical issues in language assessment. Right, so specifically in the realm of knowledge, so we have awareness of theory concept, which refer to theory and concepts directly related to language-related aspects. So this is a distinctive feature of language assessment literacy. Awareness of applied linguistics refer to the knowledge of applied linguistics like communicative language testing or task-based assessment. And the awareness of language assessment context, it refers to the awareness of the local educational context, like the local, the national assessment policies. Right? So skills, first of all, we have instructional skills. So they include like using different types of assessment, providing feedback, improving instruction based on feedback and or assessment results. Design skills are concerned with test and item construction. Skills for educational measurement refer to interpreting data collected from assessment results. And last but not least, we have technological skills. It is linked to the use of technology in assessment practices. Okay. And in terms of principles, we have 3 concepts here, which are fairness, transparency, and ethics. Okay, so we come to the third part, which is the methodology. So in this part, I'm going to talk about the research design, the participants, the instrument, and the research procedures. Okay, so this research use a qualitative approach by interviewing because the researcher believed that it was the most appropriate method to gain a sophisticated understanding of the research context. And about the participants, so 5 English teachers at a high school in Halong, they were invited to participate in the research. And the reason why they were chosen was because of the diversity in their academic qualifications, as well as their professional experience. Okay, so here is a brief summary of their profiles. So as I already mentioned, so this research used interviewing as the research instrument. And in response to the 2 research questions, so a baseline interview guide was developed. It was divided into 2 main parts. So the first part was to inquire about teachers' perceptions of their language assessment literacy. And it was closely developed based on GERO's 2018 framework. And yeah, so here is a brief summary of the research questions for part 1. Okay, so for part 2, part 2 was designed to collect data about teachers' perceived training needs in language assessment. So for question 11 and 12, for example, they were dedicated to asking about teachers' previous experience with language and testing assessment during pre-service and in-service teacher education. And for question 13 to 15, so the 3 major categories, so these questions were framed around the 3 major categories of training needs, which are classroom-focused language testing and assessment, purposes of testing, and content and concept of language testing and assessment. Okay. And so regarding the data collection process, so the invitation letters were sent to these 5 teachers, and the interview time and place were decided at their own convenience. So each interview would last for about, on average, 30 minutes, and they were all conducted in Vietnamese. At the beginning of each interview, so the researcher would deliver a brief summary of the study as well as an outline of the interview scheme. And the interviews were subsequently voice recorded as long as the participant consent had been obtained. And so the data analysis method used in this research was inductive thematic analysis. Right, so we come to probably the most important part of my research, my presentation today, which is findings and discussion. So in response to the two research questions that I have already mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, so the findings will be divided into two main parts: the perceptions of English teachers of their language assessment literacy, and second, language assessment training needs as identified by English teachers. Right. So in terms of the perceptions of English teachers of their LL, language assessment literacy, so here we have knowledge, skills, and principles. So just a reminder that this research was, it consisted of quite a lot of the interview questions. So the findings were quite a lot. So at the beginning of each subsession, I have included like a table, which is basically a summary of all the key findings of my research. So if you cannot keep up with everything I was saying, then you can just take a look at the table, and that would be, and you would do just fine. Okay, so we come to the first subsection, which is knowledge. So here are the main findings. So in terms of awareness of linguistics, so the researcher found out a mix of approaches to language assessment, task-based assessment, and communicative language testing. With regard to awareness of theory concepts, so the findings revealed inaccurate and insufficient interpretations of major qualities for assessment. And in terms of awareness of language assessment context, so all the 5 participants, they cited the influence of guidelines and policies issued by the Ministry of Education and Training and the National Foreign Language Project 2020 as the factors that have shaped their assessment practices. So first of all, we have in terms of awareness of linguistics, so there was the researcher found the uncertainty in knowledge of approaches to language assessment. So all 5 participants here, they claim to be informed of task-based approach, and they cited project-based assessment as one salient example. And 3 out of 5 teachers reported using communicative language testing. So here, the researcher found out that communicative language testing was it was misinterpreted as an entirely different approach from task-based assessment. Meanwhile, task-based assessment, in fact, constitute one key medium for designing communicative language tests. And okay, so in terms of the awareness of theory and concepts, so the findings revealed insufficiency and inaccuracy in interpretations of major qualities for assessment. So for example, in further discussion on the definition practicality, so teacher 1 referred to practicality as the connection between assessment and language knowledge that students have learned. And teacher 2 indicated that practicality could be incorporated into student tasks, such as projects based on local context. And so the practicality in their definitions was actually mistaken for authenticity, according to Brown 2005. Okay, so all 5 teachers, they failed to grasp the basic concepts behind major qualities for assessment. And this is in line with the finding by Lopez Mendoza and Bruno Arandia and Paul Pham, who indicated teachers' lack of knowledge of assessment fundamentals. So to explain why this is the case, so according to Allison 2004, theoretical foundations of assessment, so they are often presented in a reader-unfriendly way. which means that they only take account of researchers as their main audience, while dismissing teachers who may not take much of an interest in theories and concepts, which I'm sure that can relate to many of you guys here. Right? So in terms of the awareness of language assessment context, so two dispatches that I have already included here, they influence the teachers' assessment actual practices, and also the influence of the National Foreign Language Project 2020 as well. And this is similar to the finding by Fu, 2017, which suggested that high school teachers, they follow the Ministry of Education Training Assessment regulations in terms of like tests per semester, time allotment for each test. Okay. And so one notable finding here is the criticism of the washback assessment on teaching context. So there were two participants who raised concern over the mismatch between the expected outcome of high school students. So I'm sure that if any one of you guys here is a high school teacher, then you already know about this one, that students upon graduation, they need to acquire the English proficiency in order to communicate confidently in a foreign intercultural context, for example. And the National High School Graduation Examination exclusion of listening, speaking, and writing, which are all three essential communicative competencies. And this finding is aligned with the views of Diamond Cash and Babai 2015 and Sabari 2010 of the washback effects of a testing culture. Okay, so that's it for the knowledge. So let's come to the second subsection, which is the skills. So in terms of the instructional skills, so the researcher found out that the traditional testing was prioritized over alternative assessment method, and peer feedback and teacher feedback were used in their actual practices. In terms of design skills, so assessment instruments here include selected response and particularly MCQs. And in terms of the test design process, so teachers have the tendency to search for ready-made sources, and the major qualities for assessment were rarely taken into account in the test design process. For skills for educational measurement, so assessment results were used to identify students' strengths and weaknesses. And in terms of technological skills, so increased use of technology was classified as for major types of three major types, using smart classroom, creating tests on online platforms, and assessing text difficulty. Okay, so in terms of types of assessment, so traditional testing was reported to be prioritized over alternative assessment methods like project-based assessment. And one probable explanation for this lies in the test-driven culture in Vietnam. So the application of alternative assessment method, it comes at the expense of this optimal focus on traditional testing. And not to mention the fact that high school teachers, they are ill-equipped to carry out this kind of assessment. So in terms of feedback, as I already mentioned, peer and teacher feedback were used in this in the participants' actual practices. So peer feedback was of great usefulness according to the 5 participants, in the sense that it allows students to be included in the evaluation process. So the students could learn from the strengths and the weaknesses of their classmate performances, and they also had chances to develop their critical thinking, the self-confidence, and increase their concentration in class. So meanwhile, teacher feedback was claimed to be closely based on the assessment criteria, especially in the case of the project-based assessment. And the nature of the feedback will also claim to be constructive. That is that the strength of the student performances would be commented on first, followed by limitations and suggestions. And this presents a striking dissimilarity from the finding by Pham, Nguyen, and Nguyen, who pointed to teacher feedback being too general, and Nguyen, 2013, who reported the demotivating nature of teacher feedback. So for assessment instruments, selective response, particularly MCQs, were used the most frequently. And so for example, here, according to teacher 2, test design for grade 12 consists of 100% MCQs only. And the reason for this is also, it has to do with the test-driven culture of Vietnam. That is, the teachers are often under constant pressure to engage in test-like materials to familiarize their students with the exam format. So in the case of the National High School graduation examination. Okay. So in terms of the test design, so 3 out of 5 teachers, they recall starting their test design process by first looking for reliable sources with intended topics that they could apply right away. And teacher 5 here commended the quality of Oxford published materials or Cambridge published books. And this finding is supportive of the one by Nguyen, 2013, who indicated that teachers, they are inclined to mimic sample tests without any sort of critical reflection on their own assessment practices, context, and the objectives of the tests themselves. And they would rather just select the test items from book series published by international publishers. Okay, so on a similar note, so the researcher found this lack of association between test design and major qualities for assessment, which is linked back to the concept of knowledge. So all 5 participants here, they found it incredibly challenging to apply all the assessment qualities in test design, like validity, reliability, interactiveness, authenticity, and watchback. And this finding is compatible with the one by Sotana 2019, who found that expertise in test design is loosely formed by teachers' intuition, that they select and they develop test items based on their instinct rather than sound theories and foundations. On-the-job learning and suggestions or advice from their colleagues. So in terms of the technological skills, so first one, so we have the use of smart classrooms. 30 smart classrooms at school were at the teacher's disposal, and they use a software called Active Inspire, which was already installed. And however, the use of smart classroom, and in particular this software, it was mostly limited to a 15-minute test rather than like 45-minute test. And the application of technology into assessment practices was also seen in the creation of tests on online platforms like SHub Classroom or Google Forms. And last but not least, we have the evaluation test difficulty. So here, teacher 3, she recalled copying the text into like a text analyzer, and that would show the difficulty level according to the CFR levels. So overall, these findings, they mark a visible improvement in teachers' technological skills in assessing their students. And this is in contrast to the poor teacher skills in using softwares to measure students' English competences, as stated by Pham 2013. However, it is also interesting to note that teachers' use of technology in assessments was mostly limited to assessment learning, like tests, MCQ tests, for example, rather than assessment for learning, like formative assessment. Okay, so here we come to the third subsection, which is the principles. Okay, so we have three concepts here, which are fairness, ethics, and transparency. So fairness relates to test confidentiality, the role of test supervisors, and the test objectivity. So ethics here is understood as the compatibility between test level of difficulty and test takers' abilities, or a combination of major qualities for assessment. And so here I'm going to dive into this one particular finding later because this is really interesting. That is the motivation by giving higher grades to students. And transparency is defined as the ability to communicate assessment results clearly. Okay, so fairness, transparency, and ethics were perceived as extremely important among all 5 participants. So in terms of fairness, so teacher 1 and 5 defined fairness as test confidentiality. And 3 out of 5 teachers emphasized the role of exam supervisors in ensuring the fairness of the testing process. And teacher 1 here, she claimed that she could increase the test objectivity by using mostly MCQs. And for subjective assessment, then specific criteria should be included. Right, so when it comes to ethics, so as I already mentioned, this is one particular finding that I think that would relate to many teachers here. 4 out of 5 participants, they gave students higher scores on project-based assessment. And so while teacher 3, she cited students' undue focus on grades and the relativity of the assessment, the marking rubric criteria. Teacher 4 felt that grading students higher than usual was to acknowledge the hard work that the students had invested in doing the projects. And the practice of assigning students higher grade could be understood as an attempt to stress that grades can be an acknowledgement of student efforts. However, it might come at the expense of ethics. So the decision to conflate effort and achievement is open to question. It means that teachers are often unaware of different ways of student demonstration of their performances, and their observation is often limited by time, by class size, and all. And also, it raised concern over the issue of score pollution, which means that students' grade here refer to student effort more than the actual mastery of the subject matter and nothing else. Okay, so for transparency, the teachers, so all 5 teachers, four out of 5 teachers, they return the test, they conduct correction sessions, they have the student cross-check with the provided answers, and they communicate the results publicly. And this is dissimilar to the finding by Fu, who found out that assessment results were hardly discussed with students. However, one teacher 4 actually, and she informed students, she only informed students who wanted to know the score, as announcing results publicly, in her opinion, was not encouraging. And this is also in line with the finding by Lipnavik and Smith, 2008, who stated that students who were not informed of their grades had higher level of test-specific self-efficacy than those who were. Okay, so that's it for the findings for the first research question. So for the second research question, so the findings were classified under the 2 main components, the received training and the needed training. Right, so for the received training, so the researcher found a lack of training in language testing and assessment in pre-service and in-service teacher education. So all 5 sample teachers, they reported having learned little about their language assessment during their pre-service and in-service teacher education training. And formal teacher education predominantly focus on teaching methodology, which is in line with the finding by Sultana, who indicated that assessment was only taught briefly in bachelor education courses. So, which is in contrast to the vast majority of attention given to teaching how to teach. So 3 out of 5 respondents, they asserted that their colleagues constituted a significant part of their professional development. And this finding shows support of those by Phil Sagari and Sultana, who cited colleagues as key resources of assessment strategies. Right. So in terms of received training, so the findings were framed around 3 main components: the classroom-focused LTA, language testing assessment. So overall, giving feedback, preparing classroom tests, and interpreting results featured among the prioritized areas for teachers' assessment training needs. And this is aligned with the findings by Hazel Green, Carson Helness, and for 2017. And however, it runs counter to that of Folks and Silgari 2014, who suggested that using portfolios and self or peer assessment are the areas identified as most needed. So for grade purposes of testing, so grade giving and identification of what needs to be taught or reinforced ranked high among teacher perceived training needs. So grade giving was rated the highest among all 5 participants. And the reason for this is simple. It is because giving grades is the ultimate goal of teachers in accordance with their administrative responsibility. So identification of what needs to be taught or reinforced is also highly welcomed by 4 participants. And the reason for this is that they want to prepare themselves for making adjustments in their teaching. So all in all, giving grades and finding out what needs to be taught rank high on teachers' need for training on language testing and assessment. And this is in line with Vitamin Nguyen reported the prioritization of giving grades for ranking and completion of administrative responsibilities. But it is not in line with the finding by Hazel Green, who reported that teachers receive training needs for all areas, including awarding certificates and placing students into programs. So the differences in the findings could stem from the differences in the research context. Okay, so and in terms of content and concept of language testing assessment, so integrated language skills was selected as the most needed area of training by all 5 participants. And to justify this, so teaching currently in Vietnam, language teaching is grounded in the approach of communicative language testing, teaching. And aspects of culture were shown to attract keen interest from 3 participants. And teacher 3 and 4 here underscore the importance of cultural aspects in influencing the language use. So to summarize, the integrated skills and aspect of culture were chosen as the most important areas of training. And this reflects the goal of the new curriculum described in this dispatch issued by the Ministry of Education Training, which is to promote learners' communicative competences and cultural awareness. Right, so that's it for the 4th part, which is the findings and discussion. So we come to the last part of my presentation today, which is so the limitations for it have gone over. So yeah, so the findings are classified under 3 central components: knowledge, skills, and principles. Okay, so in terms of limitations, so despite the researchers' best efforts, there are still several limitations that need to be considered. The first one is that participants may not be completely truthful in their interviews. The second is that due to time and convenience factors, so interviewing was used as the only research instrument. And the research was conducted on 5 English teachers only. So the findings here may not be generalizable to all high schools in Vietnam. So in response to those mentioned limitations, so future research could dive deeper into teachers' real-life practices of assessment in comparison with their perceptions. So in this sense, observations could be really helpful. They could serve as a checkpoint for teachers to, to kind of checkpoint for against the data collected from the interviews. And a bigger sample size was also highly recommended. So it could include multiple schools, high schools in Vietnam. And last but not least, so future investigation into language assessment literacy could direct their attention to teacher initial education training programs to probe into specific needs on language assessment. Yep, so that is the end of my presentation today. So thank you so much for listening, and I would welcome any kind of concerns or any questions from you. Okay, so wait. Okay, so I have received one question here. What types of properly language testing and assessment could be used in high school? Actually, I'm not really sure about this question because language testing assessment, right? Okay, so it would be closely based in your own context as well. So okay, so let's just kind of limit the findings to the research to the assessment method. So we could use a combination of traditional testing, paper-based testing, and alternative assessment like portfolio assessment or project-based assessment, other kinds of formative assessment that we could think of. So, but to answer this question, it kind of had to so the teachers themselves, they have to reflect on their own assessment context as well in order to identify which assessment method would suit best their assessment context. So yeah, okay, so that is my answer. So okay. Yeah, sure, thank you. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, so you can type in the comment section, the chat box. So for project, okay, so I got a question from Chen. For project-based assessment, do you have any standby feedback form? Unfortunately, I do not have one. So based on my research, based on the interview answers that I collected from the participants in my research, so they use a quite generic feedback form, which includes several criteria like delivery of the presentation, the language used, the structure, the clarity of the structure, etc. So it was quite generic, quite general, and so yeah, I think that any standard feedback form for project-based assessment was quite impossible because it had to be based on your own assessment needs as well, what you want to assess your students. So yeah, I don't have any standard feedback form. So okay, so question from Cho, how the less number of participants related to bias of your study? Did you explain in your study? If so, could you say something? So yeah, I don't know if I got your question right, but so yeah, in my research, actually, this research was conducted as my thesis graduation. So I only I could only reach out to 5 participants. So the number of the participants was yeah, it did not allow the findings to be generalized. So I'm not very sure about the part when you said bias in your study, but yeah, I did include that in the limitations, and I also made some recommendations regarding that future research should include more participants, more teachers from different schools. Yeah. So any other questions? Okay, so 3 teams you mentioned, knowledge, skills, and principle are relevant to your topic studies. Yeah, because I used the definition by Davies 2008, which defined language assessment literacy as a combination of 3 knowledge, skills, and principles. So yeah, it was definitely relevant to my research topic. So yeah, I mean the relationship. I'm not sure if I understood your question, but if you want to ask me directly, then you could contact me via my email. And yeah, so I could ask for more clarification regarding your question. I'm sorry, it's okay. Okay. So it's actually, so it's better. Okay. Okay, so I think that's it for the Q&A, right? So I'm gonna give the time that I have left for the panelists.
Okay. Thank you everyone for your questions. And I think that we have covered all of the questions. And Ms. Ha, do you have anything else you want to cover before I wrap up?
Well, I don't think I have any questions, but so if anyone you guys here, like you still have any questions regarding my research, or you just want to chat more about language assessment, which is my area of interest, then you could contact me via email. And yeah, it's a way for us to like expand our professional networking. So thank you guys so much for your participation.
Yes, okay. I can see the hand of Miss Shoyali Cho, but sorry that we cannot we don't have enough time for questions now. But I will get you connected with our presenter, and that you can give more information about this topic. Okay, and now. That's the end of our webinar today. And thank you very much for everyone for joining the Mekong Tea Song to discuss the topic on teachers' language assessment. And we hope that you enjoyed today's presentation and have your own take-home message. The link to the feedback form will be sent to you via your email. And before we sign off, I'd like to tell you that our next webinar will be on the 17th and the 19th of September. So for next week, we have 2 webinars, one on Friday and one on Sunday. The information about our webinar will be published on our fan page. And thank you again for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.